The sky over the Netherlands was gray and bitterly cold that December morning in 1942. A wounded American bomber limped across the clouds, its engines coughing, its fuselage torn open by cannon fire. Inside, the crew of a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress knew they would never make it back to England. Below them lay German-occupied territory. The pilot had only two choices: crash into the freezing waters of the North Sea, or land on a German airfield and spend the rest of the war as a prisoner. He chose the airfield. Within minutes of landing, German soldiers surrounded the aircraft. The crew was captured, but the bomber itself was something far more valuable. It was the first intact B-17 Flying Fortress the Germans had ever laid their hands on. 3 days later, a powerful figure from the German High Command arrived to inspect it. His name was Erhard Milch, the man responsible for the entire aircraft production of Nazi Germany during World War II. Milch expected to study an enemy weapon. Instead, as he slowly walked around the massive bomber sitting on the cold concrete floor of the hangar, he realized something far more disturbing. This aircraft was not just a machine of war. It was proof. Proof that Germany might already have lost the war. Long before that captured bomber arrived in Germany, Erhard Milch had already begun to worry about the future of the war. Unlike many leaders inside the Nazi regime, Milch was not a man of ideology. He was not driven by grand speeches about destiny or victory. He believed in numbers, factories, and logistics. To Milch, wars were not won by slogans or faith. They were won by production lines. Born in 1892, he had served as an artillery officer and reconnaissance pilot during World War I. After the war ended, when Germany was forbidden from maintaining a military air force, Milch moved into civilian aviation. By the mid-1920s, he had become managing director of Lufthansa, where he learned how to manage fleets of aircraft, supply chains, maintenance systems, and industrial planning. When the Nazi regime began secretly rebuilding Germany's military, Milch was the perfect administrator for the job. By 1935, he had become state secretary for aviation, effectively the second most powerful man in the German Air Force. Above him stood Hermann Goering, the flamboyant commander of the Luftwaffe. The two men could not have been more different. Goering had been a famous fighter ace during World War I. He was charismatic, theatrical, and deeply political. He believed morale, courage, and aggressive tactics would guarantee German victory. Milch believed something else entirely. He believed victory depended on factories. Where Goering saw glory, Milch saw production charts. Where Goering made promises, Milch calculated capacity. By late 1942, those calculations were becoming deeply troubling. German fighter pilots were reporting encounters with a new American bomber that seemed almost impossible to destroy. The aircraft was the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, a four-engine heavy bomber flying from bases in Britain. Reports from the front described the same disturbing pattern. German fighters would attack the bombers with cannon fire. Shells would explode across the fuselage. Wings would burn. Engines would smoke. And yet the bombers kept flying. Some returned to England with entire sections of their fuselage torn away. Others landed safely with engines on fire or control surfaces riddled with holes. Pilots began referring to the American aircraft as a fortress in the sky. One of the men reporting these encounters was Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's most respected fighter commanders. During a conference in October 1942 at Germany's secret aviation test center in Rechlin, Galland described the bomber to assembled officers. The aircraft, he said, possessed every possible advantage for a bomber: heavy armor, enormous altitude capability, powerful defensive guns, and remarkable speed for its size. German pilots had discovered that attacking these bombers was extremely dangerous. A single formation could fill the sky with machine gun fire, creating what pilots described as a wall of lead. Milch listened carefully. He had already examined the wreckage of a crashed B-17 that had been recovered earlier that month. German engineers had painstakingly reconstructed parts of the aircraft in a hangar so they could study its structure. The partially rebuilt bomber stood there like a puzzle of aluminum and steel. As Milch walked around it, taking measurements and reviewing technical notes, a troubling thought began forming in his mind. This aircraft was not simply well designed. It was something far more significant. It was built for mass production, and if the United States could manufacture machines this complex in large numbers, then Germany was not merely facing a new weapon. It was facing an enemy with an industrial capacity unlike anything the world had ever seen. Milch did not yet know how right that fear would prove to be, because only weeks later, in December 1942, the Germans would capture something even more valuable than wreckage. They would capture a complete flying fortress. And that discovery would confirm the worst fears he had been quietly calculating for months. On the morning of the 12th of December 1942, a formation of American bombers crossed the English Channel and headed toward occupied France. Their mission was part of a growing strategy developed by the United States Army Air Forces. Instead of bombing cities blindly at night, American planners believed in daylight precision bombing. The idea was simple in theory, but incredibly dangerous in practice. Heavy bombers would fly in tight formations during the day, using their powerful defensive guns to protect each other while striking industrial targets deep inside enemy territory. Among the aircraft in that formation was a Boeing B-17 flying fortress known by its crew as Wolfhound. As the bombers approached their target, German radar stations detected the incoming formation. Within minutes, fighter squadrons of the Luftwaffe were scrambled to intercept. Soon the sky filled with aircraft. German fighters climbed rapidly toward the bombers, their cannons ready. As they closed in, the air erupted with explosions and tracer fire. The bombers responded immediately, their defensive machine guns creating a storm of bullets around the formation. The battle was chaotic. German fighters attacked from the front, from above, and from behind, firing bursts of cannon shells that slammed into the aluminum bodies of the bombers. Some aircraft were torn apart in midair. Others caught fire and spiraled toward the ground. The Wolfhound was hit repeatedly. Cannon shells ripped through its wings and fuselage. One engine began to fail. Hydraulic lines were damaged, and fragments of metal tore through parts of the aircraft's interior. Inside the bomber, the crew fought to keep the aircraft under control. Smoke filled parts of the cabin. Instruments flickered. Every vibration of the airframe suggested the aircraft might break apart at any moment, but the bomber kept flying. That was the strange strength of the B-17 flying fortress. Even when badly damaged, its structure often remained strong enough to keep the aircraft airborne. The crew knew they could never reach England. Crossing the North Sea with a crippled bomber would almost certainly end in disaster. The freezing water below meant death within minutes for anyone forced to ditch. The pilot faced a brutal decision. He could attempt the long flight back and risk losing everyone in the ocean, or he could land in enemy territory and surrender. He chose survival. The damaged bomber descended toward a German-controlled airfield in the Netherlands. With its engine struggling and parts of its structure barely holding together, the aircraft made a rough landing on the runway. Within moments, German soldiers surrounded the bomber. The crew was taken prisoner, but the aircraft itself was left almost completely intact. For the first time in the war, the Germans possessed a fully operational B-17 flying fortress that could be studied in detail. To German engineers and intelligence officers, the captured bomber was a priceless opportunity. The aircraft was quickly transported under heavy guard to Germany's most secret aviation testing facility. The destination was the Luftwaffe Research Center at Rechlin. There, engineers would dismantle the aircraft piece by piece, analyzing every system, every weapon, and every structural component. But before that detailed examination began, one man insisted on seeing the aircraft personally. When Erhard Milch arrived at the hangar a few days later, the massive bomber stood silently under the dim lights. It was no longer a combat aircraft. Now it was evidence. And as Milch began his inspection, he would soon realize that this single machine revealed something terrifying about the balance of power in World War II. When Erhard Milch stepped into the hangar at the Luftwaffe Test Center in Rechlin, the captured Boeing B-17 flying fortress stood quietly under the lights. At first glance, it looked like any other bomber. But Milch approached the aircraft slowly, studying every detail with the careful attention of an engineer rather than a general. German technicians had already begun their preliminary inspection. Panels had been opened, sections of armor had been removed for measurement, Engineers stood nearby with notebooks filled with sketches and calculations. Milch began with the defensive systems. The bomber carried an extraordinary number of machine guns for an aircraft of its size. Turrets covered nearly every angle: nose, dorsal, ventral, waist, and tail. Together, they created overlapping fields of fire that allowed the bomber to defend itself from multiple directions. This was not accidental. The entire design of the aircraft assumed it would face heavy fighter opposition. Next, Milch examined the structure of the aircraft. The fuselage was reinforced with thick aluminum frames. Vital sections of the crew compartment were protected by armor plates. Even the fuel tanks had protective systems designed to reduce the risk of catastrophic fire. This explained the reports German fighter pilots had been sending for months. The aircraft was built to survive damage. But it was something else that truly troubled Milch. He noticed how the aircraft had been constructed. The internal systems were organized with remarkable efficiency. Electrical lines, hydraulic systems, and mechanical components were arranged in a way that made them easy to install, replace, or repair. Many sections appeared to be designed as standardized modules. To an experienced production manager, the meaning was obvious. This aircraft had not simply been engineered for performance. It had been engineered for mass production. That realization triggered a far more disturbing calculation. The United States possessed enormous industrial resources. Its factories stretched across an entire continent. Its supply of aluminum, fuel, and trained labor far exceeded anything available to Germany. If American factories were capable of producing aircraft of this complexity quickly and in large quantities, then the implications for the war were enormous. Milch began comparing production figures. German aircraft factories were working at full capacity, producing roughly 20 to 25,000 aircraft per year. Even with new factories and increased labor, expanding beyond that number would be extremely difficult. But American production estimates were far higher. Reports suggested that the United States might soon produce more than 80,000 aircraft in a single year. The numbers were staggering. Even if German fighters destroyed large numbers of American bombers, the United States could replace those losses almost immediately. Germany could not. For Milch, the conclusion was unavoidable. If the war turned into a long industrial struggle, Germany would eventually lose. Shortly after completing his inspection, Milch prepared a report for the leadership of the Luftwaffe. In that report, he warned that the growing American strategic bombing campaign could overwhelm German defenses through sheer production power. The problem was not simply the quality of the aircraft. It was the scale. If American bombers continued to appear over Europe in increasing numbers, Germany's fighter force and anti-aircraft defenses would eventually be stretched beyond their limits. But when the report reached the desk of Hermann Göring, the response was dismissive. Göring had made bold promises to Adolf Hitler. He had repeatedly assured the Nazi leadership that German air defenses would protect the Reich from large-scale bombing. Admitting the danger would mean admitting those promises were unrealistic. So the warning was largely ignored. Inside the German command structure, the numbers were clear. But politics had already begun to drown out the mathematics of war. While German leaders debated warnings and reports, the United States was rapidly transforming the nature of warfare. Factories across America were expanding at an extraordinary pace. Automobile plants were converted into aircraft assembly lines. Steel mills, aluminum refineries, and engine manufacturers were all redirected toward one goal: producing aircraft in massive numbers for the war effort. This industrial mobilization was directed by the United States Army Air Forces, which believed that strategic bombing could cripple an enemy's ability to wage war. The concept was bold. Instead of focusing only on battlefield victories, American planners intended to destroy the enemy's industrial capacity itself. Factories, railroads, oil refineries, and power plants became primary targets. To accomplish this strategy, the United States relied heavily on the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. The aircraft had been designed specifically for long-range strategic bombing. With 4 powerful engines and a large bomb capacity, the B-17 could fly deep into enemy territory while carrying heavy defensive armament. Even more important was how the aircraft was used. Rather than sending small numbers of bombers, American planners deployed them in large formations. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of aircraft would fly together in tightly organized combat boxes. Each bomber's guns protected the others, creating overlapping defensive firepower. To German fighter pilots, attacking these formations could feel like flying directly into a storm of bullets. As the war continued through 1943 and 1944, the scale of these bombing missions grew dramatically. Large formations of bombers crossed the skies of occupied Europe almost daily, striking industrial targets inside Germany itself. These operations formed part of the wider Allied air campaign that gradually weakened the German war machine during World War II. Oil facilities were damaged. Transportation networks were disrupted. Aircraft factories struggled to maintain production under constant attack. At the same time, the Allies were preparing for one of the most important military operations in modern history, the invasion of Western Europe. By 1944, the Allied air forces had achieved increasing control of the skies above France and Germany. This air superiority played a crucial role in enabling the massive amphibious assault known as the Normandy landings. Without the destruction of German industry and the weakening of the Luftwaffe, such an invasion would have been far more dangerous. For American planners, the bombing campaign proved something fundamental about modern warfare. Industrial power could shape the battlefield long before armies ever met on the ground. And in that industrial struggle, the factories of the United States were producing aircraft faster than Germany could destroy them. In the end, the captured Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress that stood inside the hangar at Rechlin was just one aircraft among thousands. But to Erhard Milch, it represented something much larger than a single machine. It represented a new kind of war. By 1943 and 1944, the skies over Germany were increasingly filled with Allied bombers. Massive formations crossed the continent day after day, targeting factories, oil refineries, rail hubs, and military infrastructure. The German air defense system fought back fiercely, but the pressure kept growing. Every bomber shot down was eventually replaced. Every damaged factory was attacked again. And every year, the industrial power of the United States expanded even further. During World War II, American industry ultimately produced nearly 300,000 military aircraft. Germany, despite enormous efforts and the reorganization of its war economy under Albert Speer, could not match that scale. The imbalance became impossible to ignore. German fighter pilots continued to fight with extraordinary skill and courage. New aircraft designs appeared, defensive systems improved, but the mathematics of production could not be reversed. Factories destroyed aircraft faster than pilots could shoot them down. In many ways, the war had become a contest not only of armies and weapons, but of industrial systems. The United States possessed vast natural resources, enormous manufacturing capacity, and a workforce capable of sustaining production on a scale never before seen in history. That industrial strength allowed the Allies to maintain constant pressure on Germany from the air. Looking back, the moment when Milch inspected that captured bomber reveals a powerful lesson about modern warfare. Technology matters. Strategy matters. But behind every aircraft, every tank, and every weapon stands an entire industrial system capable of producing it. Milch understood this earlier than many others inside the German leadership. Standing beside that silent bomber in the hangar, he had already seen the future of the war written in aluminum, steel, and rivets. Sometimes the outcome of a conflict is not decided on the battlefield. Sometimes it is decided in factories, supply chains, and production lines long before the fighting even begins. And in the case of World War II, that industrial reality helped shape the final outcome of the war itself.